There will always be suffering unless we understand what actually is creating those suffering, those problems. And that relies on you. Now, this is not some spiritual, medicinal, new age video that I'm here to say, well, you need to change your worldview and your mind and your body. I'm going to tell it to you like it is. There's always going to be war, there's always going to be democide, unless we get rid of statism, a certain particular belief system that everybody, whether they're religious, political, new age, they're never going to tell you about. They're never going to, because they don't know about it, and they've never looked into it, and it's always off topic. It's always something that they just take for granted as to say, well, this is natural. Slavery is natural. Statism is mental slavery. Why is it mental slavery? Because you think that you are less than other human beings, that they get the right to rule over you, or that they have more rights than you. That's what statism is. It's mental slavery. Everybody from Gandhi to Bob Marley have talked about that. Okay, you have many people, philosophers of all kinds, talking about what mental slavery is, how it's the worst form, Martin Luther King Jr. as well, and how it turns into physical slavery when it's unchecked, when we don't know that it's taking place. You may say, well, it's brainwashing, it's being mind controlled. You may say that as well. It's being the willing slave, the person who says, I can be a slave, I should be a slave, it's natural for me to. And this belief system has been held for 6,000 years until the 1800s, where the end of chattel slavery was ended. But that was chattel slavery. Let me tell you something. You don't have war without slavery. You don't have democide without slavery. You don't have mass suffering without slavery. So, if I want to say that there's going to be an end to suffering in the world, first of all, mass suffering can be ended. Individual suffering will always exist. You know why? Because it teaches us a lesson. Mass suffering should surely teach us a lesson too, but we haven't learned from history. If we did, we'd learn from 6,000 years of experience, of governments constantly toppling on top of each other, changing in form all the time, trying to appeal to the morality of people, but still claiming that certain people have more moral rights than other human beings. How is that so? Does anybody have a moral, legitimate right over your life and property than you? Does anybody? When you look at the morality of it, no other excuses, just the morality. Because what was the very main reason why we got rid of chattel slavery in the 1800s? Because of morality. So if we care about other people, we care to reduce suffering, we would care especially to get rid of the mass suffering in the world. That which suffers and then expands into even more suffering. How is that possible unless it's through a system that people actively legitimize and say, this is legitimate suffering, this can take place. Otherwise, why would people let such mass suffering take place? Ask yourself what happened in the 20th century. That you had Germany and Russia and China and Italy, all these places killing millions of people in what's called democide, the number one cause of unnatural death. How does that happen? It doesn't just happen out of nowhere. It doesn't just happen because of bad leaders and bad policies. It happens because of people who follow one person or a few people and give away their rights and ownership to them. So that way they don't have to think for themselves. These people are doing the thinking for them and telling them to bring people to the camps, bringing them to the gulags, bringing them ultimately to their death on behalf of this state. That's where we get the word statism, and that's why I call it mental slavery, because when there is war, then you have surrendering, you have captives, captivity, that is slavery. War creates slavery. I have a whole video talking about the relationship between war and slavery. This is very big if you want to understand suffering, because let's be honest, who likes war? Oh, I like war. You do? So you want war? No, you don't want, I don't want war, but I think it's cool. Yeah, you don't want war so long as you have a moral conscience to realize that it involves suffering. Now, when there's individual suffering, that's always going to exist But due to a similar reason, what is that reason that an individual would suffer? Now I'm not looking at government, I'm not looking at war, I'm not looking at democide, none of that stuff. I'm looking at you. What causes you to suffer? Either a lack of knowledge within your mind, body, or soul, a lack of control within your mind, body, and soul. It's one or the other, right? And of course, there's these other occurrences that can happen that are out of your control, but for the most part, you are in control of your life and your destiny. Are you? No. Are you? Because when you lack the control, and maybe the disease takes over your body, are you really in control of your own body? It's still slavery. But it's not the same type of slavery, is it? See, the slavery I talk about with government is not the same as chattel slavery. The slavery I talk about with yourself and toward you and the disease that you're actively fighting that's taking over your whole body, that's not the same type of slavery either. But it's still slavery. So the same suffering sort of happens individually, microcosmically, and macrocosmically, through the governments, through the mass amount of armies and people who are carrying out orders for others, giving away their responsibilities and ownership to others. It's the lack of ownership over the mind, body, and soul, the lack of responsibility, the lack of keeping it able, because that's what responsibility means. It's not just saying, yeah, this is my mind, body, soul. No, it's taking care of it to the best of your ability. And if you do, then are you really suffering, right? You say, well, I've done everything I could. Well, if you did everything you could, really, if you're still suffering, there's still more knowledge to obtain. There's still more you have to get down to the root cause. Now, you could be suffering and you could be trying everything that you could, right? But I'm sure you made some learning lessons on the way. I'm sure you met some friends on the way, right? Because that's what it means. And then if you say, whoa, I don't have that, then you're suffering in another way, which also must be addressed. All suffering can be solved with knowledge, with responsibility, with enough courage and persistence and enough willpower. That's what's beautiful in this life. And what do you see when people go into war? When people give away their life and property to this imaginary state of existence, to politicians? They're giving away their own self-control. They're saying, you handle it for me. To doctors, they give them pills. I'll take this pill, it will help me. I'm giving away my self-responsibility to them because I trust them. That's the thing. You rely purely on faith. It's sort of a religion for you. You rely on them. And so if something goes wrong, you say, please, could you change it for me? This is why we have suffering, because we lack independence, so we're always in dependence. And oh my gosh, doesn't dependence kind of relate to slavery? Well, yeah, if you're fully independent, right? And you're not independent. So that is the difference between freedom and slavery. It's understanding suffering. It's the same thing. Because freedom is not suffering. If you're free, then there's nothing that you have currently holding you back. And if something is holding you back, well, if I had a rock on top of my head, the only way I get that off me is with enough strength or with the help of other people. That's the only way I can get past it. And there needs to be enough momentum. There needs to be maybe a good configuration to get that off of me. But either way, that's what has to be done in order to end the suffering. It needs to be gone. It needs to be abolished. That's why the word abolitionism in the 1800s was used to abolish slavery. Because you're getting rid of a system that doesn't need to exist because it doesn't naturally exist. Nobody comes out of the womb with more rights and becomes king. Like, oh, we have a baby. This is the king of the world. No, it isn't. Okay, every human being is the same. We're all equal. Where do we get this idea from that certain people are more special than others? This is always going to be the root cause to our suffering, because again, it always leads to the lack of self-control and order following and people thinking that no, they are not in charge of their own lives. So that is ultimately what I wanted to say here, because people will complain about everything that's happening in the world, and rightfully so, they can complain. But do they realize where all the suffering is actually coming from? The same source over and over, even if it's in their individual health and lifestyle. It's in the food, it's in the drugs, it's in the mentalities. And the mentalities is what creates all of that. So it's all due to what we perceive and what we think, because that's what becomes. So that is how we end suffering. Our suffering is a feeling, an emotion that comes through of the mind, and then we feel it physically. Again, mental slavery to physical slavery. That is the root. Mental slavery. So you can start with being in charge of your mind, because it's the best thing you can do. And trust me, of course, you're not in control of everything. You can't be in control of everything. You shouldn't be in control of everything. That's why we have the help of each other. That's why we're all here for each other. Oh my gosh, how do we end suffering? Well, it surely helps to have some love, to have some people on your side. Of course. Of course. So you can say there will always be suffering unless we have people together. Well, how do you have people together? If certain people are ruling over other people, is that really something of a community where people are working together? Or is it somewhere where people feel like they're just dependent upon the marching orders that they're given? That's not people doing things out of care. That's people doing things out of somebody telling them to do it. That's not morality. And that's suffering for their own conscience, for their own will, for their own ability to simply be human, which is to think for themselves. They're given that ability, so why should they suppress it? That's all. Suffering is simply because of people not listening to their own nature, not doing what needs to be done, what is intended to be done for their nature. So thank you very much for listening. This is Corey Edmund Engelot. Share your thoughts with me as well. Nature is the answer.